Hey, young Hamalia, Ahuya, Tisto, Tuito, Anotet. My name is Ethan Red Eagle, and it's nice to be here with each of you guys today. I'll be talking about cross-cultural etiquette and more of a socio-cultural insight. Um, as I said, my name is Red Eagle. I come from 4 different tribes. I'm a quarter Inupiq. My family's village is Kotzebue up in Alaska, and I'm also a quarter Lakota. I'm a quarter Dene, or as most people know, Navajo, and I'm a quarter Tohono which I'm an enrolled member of, and it's located in southern Arizona. Part of my background is I have been working with intercultural specialists for about 14 years now, working with different cultures. And I specialize more into tribal liaison, and I've been doing that for about 9 years. Being a planner is relatively recent and have only been doing that with SHN for about 5 years now. Over the course of those years, I've interacted professionally with over 60 tribes throughout the nation and have visited over 120 reservations personally, and have interacted with people from over 200 tribes. A few disclaimers before I dive into the details. First is I'm not speaking on behalf of all the tribes. I'm only speaking generally, not officially. If you need more details, I encourage you to contact a tribal representative of the tribe you are interacting with or working with or partnering with. What I'll be giving is just general information. Another disclaimer, this is not intended for legal advice. If you need legal guidance regarding tribes, California Indian Legal Services comes highly recommended, and they do a lot of great work here in our area. And here's the contact information for them. Another disclaimer is results may vary. And what I mean by that is cross-cultural etiquette is not just a science, it's also an art. In other words, it takes time, it takes skill, and results may vary according to tribes' level of culture, traditional customs, and level of assimilation, as well as their own cross-cultural expertise and experience as well. And I'll dive more into that, what that exactly means in a little bit. My last disclaimer is I'm only presenting sociocultural. There are numerous subsets of culture, and each of these on this list apply to culture. And so I'll be talking primarily about socioculture. This is part of a series, as was mentioned before, tribal consultation I did back in 2019, pre-COVID, so it wasn't recorded. And then I did tribal sovereignty, introduction into tribal governments. I did tribal consultation as well as tribal lands. And so those are available, and we hope to do cultural mitigations as well as tribal confidentiality in the near future. If not this year, then possibly next year. So this is part of an overall series that I have been doing. And this ties in and builds on top of kind of the other presentations and is an introduction into them as well. So here's my outline for what I have in mind to do today. The introduction, which I've covered, I'll dive into cross-cultural communication and then kind of things to keep in mind and understand before the meeting, during the meeting, and then after the meeting. And then I'll briefly cover some overall best practices, and then I hope to leave some time for Q&A, but we'll see how time is during that period. So I have two polling questions, and this first polling question, as it's being pulled up, is how many federally recognized tribes are there? A, 229, B, 365, C, 400, or D, 574?
And I should mention the answers are anonymous, so we won't know how you voted and won't grade you for this. Okay, we have the majority of people coming in. I'll give you a few more seconds. And the polling and the results is just about 27% suggested 229 and 22% suggested 365. 7% said 400 and the majority was 574 at 44%. I guess I can share those too.
Perfect. Yes, we can see it. The majority is right. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the US. There are 400 alone in Alaska, and there are 229 federally unrecognized tribes in the US, and there was a big campaign called 365 of a native photographer going around to different reservations and photographing each of these tribes. And so each of these numbers tie in, but the majority is right, 574. So good job. Let's see. Now I'll dive into cross-cultural communication. When I mention culture, there are so many different definitions out there about what culture is, and some that are what culture is not. And so culture is a group that share these same items: physically, social, relationally, intellectually, emotionally, behaviorally, spiritually, having the same values, beliefs, knowledge, social actions, customs, mission, and traditions. And so it's really broad and encompassing, and this is what I want you to keep in mind when I mention like culture A and culture B in the description that I'm going to be using in a little bit. Also, with a lot of terminologies out there, there's cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, and some people may have a hard time understanding how those all fit together. And so I made this little chart showing cultural awareness as an overarching umbrella and cultural knowledge at the beginning. So you need to gain knowledge about the culture, and then next you have cultural sensitivity, and that's being aware of the culture and applying the cultural knowledge. And then when you start to apply that cultural knowledge well, then it turns into cultural competence. And so what I'll be providing today is the cultural knowledge with some cultural sensitivity of guidance on how to apply it. And so it's up to you to apply it, and then applying it well, bringing you into cultural competence, if you're not already there. So the thing I want to stress is the relational component. There are numerous kind of projects, and tribes can be anywhere on the spectrum as well. But one thing that is the same, that is constant throughout, is the relationship, the link that is in between. And so that's what I'll be covering in building, strengthening, and maintaining that relationship. So I have a quick example. I want you to picture in your mind a dog. What does that dog look like? What the context that that dog is in? And I want to bring up a contrast as an example. And so now that you have the dog pictured in your mind, maybe it's your own dog, here's what we would often call res dog. Um, it's it has certain kind of stereotypes, and it's, I think, on one end of the spectrum. And then we have this dog on the other side of the spectrum. Um, most reservations, dogs are kind of like big rodents, and they're not something you pet or spend money on, or let alone have in your house, although that is starting to change. And I remember one time being in San Diego and I saw a dog in a stroller and I couldn't believe it. I mean, this dog was living its best life and was probably eating better than I was. And so the reason why I bring this up is to show the contrast of when someone says a dog, people think of different things. And I'm not saying you think of either one of these, you're probably somewhere in the middle. But I'm just showing that there's this big spectrum. And when someone uses a term or an action, that it could be on that spectrum. And so understanding that difference on the spectrum is key in cross-cultural understanding and cross-cultural competence and etiquette as well. So here's what I mean by that. There's this cycle of cross-cultural communication. First is what was meant, then comes, so first is what was meant, and then second comes what was said. Then after that comes what is heard. And then after that is what is understood. So all four of these play a role in communication in general. And communication can break down at any one of these 4 points. And cross-cultural adds a whole nother layer of culture on top of that. We have cultural idioms. Every culture has cultural idioms. And so communication is hard enough as it is, and cross-cultural communication is even more difficult. And when there's a break in either one of these chains, it can usually cause a miscommunication or a misunderstanding, or even worse, or something worse. And this not only happens on the given side, but on the receiving side as well. What was meant, what was said, what was heard, and what was understood. And that goes both ways. So there are two different cultures in this illustration, culture A and culture B, and they're just different. And so they're apart and there's no connection. The key with cross-cultural communication and cross-cultural etiquette and cross-cultural competence is to provide some overlap, not complete overlap, because then it'd be the same culture, but there is some overlap where some of that exchange happens, where cross-cultural communication can happen well. And so this is the key of what I'm presenting today. One tribe, so I studied cultures in general, and I study tribes particularly. There's a tribe in Africa that has this saying, Sawabona and Sukona is a saying that it's like a call and response saying that they say to each other. And it means to be seen, to see and to be seen. And so it's this call and response of I see you, and the other person says I see you too, or it's good to be seen. And that is really the goals for cross-cultural communication, is to be seen, to be heard, and to be understood. And well, that's true of communication and people in general, but it also applies to cross-cultural. So when good cross-cultural communication happens, there's this dance that kind of happens with culture A and culture B, and it's a good dance to perform. With that, here's my second and last polling question. is what is the proper tribal terminology? Is it Native American, First Nations, Indigenous, American Indian, or all the above?
All right, we'll give it another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Here you go, the results, Ethan.
Looks like the majority, 91%, said all the above, and that is correct. Depending on what region, there are preferences for these, and depending on what region, each of these can apply. For an example, here on the West Coast, we kind of prefer Native American. In the North, we prefer First Nations. In kind of the Southern region, we prefer Indigenous. And in the East Coast, it's typically preferred American Indian. And so it's good to understand terminology is a big thing, and understanding the differences and the connection with it all. But I definitely encourage you not to use one of these, just to use the tribe's name and use the tribal name instead of one of these general names. A misconception by using one of these terminologies is the impression that all the tribes are the same, or that all the tribes are similar in whatever context you may be using it. Many people who ask me questions about tribes know my default answer is it depends on the tribe. Because some tribes prefer this, some do that, and it just varies from tribe by tribe. So that is that on the terminology. I created this chart that I'll be using for before the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting. And it's this little table. And the topic's going to be up here at the top. And I put American on one side and Native American on the other to show the contrast. And then this row here shows kind of a good example or reason or comment. And then the bottom shows kind of a bad example or the reason or comment there. And so I'll be using this format to address some of the topics in before, during, and after meeting. So let's dive into before the meeting. Before the meeting, there should always be an introduction. This is true of both cultures. Americans usually have a greeting like hi, hello, how are you doing today? These are all kind of forms of greetings that is typical in America. In Native American culture, there is and kind of an unspoken rule that part of the introduction is you name yourself, you name typically your family and your tribe that you are a descendant from or affiliated with. And so sometimes Native Americans we will give that long introduction. So just know that that's to be expected. Also, what is common in American culture is to find common ground where the things are the same, where you connect, and common ground. And no matter what it is, sometimes it's occupation or hobbies or different things like that. In Native American culture, it's good to apply this common ground if the common ground's there. If, for an example, if you're part of the same tribe, then you dive deeper into family and the village and different things like that. But if you're from different tribes, then it's not the same, it's just different, and different's okay. And one mistake that Americans often make is trying to imply the same, or at least it's kind of perceived to imply the same. For an example, if someone is a half-blooded Native American and someone is 1/64th, sometimes they will say, "Oh, I'm 1/64th." And sometimes that isn't always the best in regards to the introduction, because there's this whole kind of quasi caste and caste based system um, where their blood levels definitely plays a role, as well as numerous other things. I'm not going to dive too far into that, but just so that you're aware. And for an example, a Native American may it may not make sense for a Native American to say, "Oh, I'm 1/64th white." That's our connection. It sounds similar to that. So keep that in mind in the introduction part. Next is eye contact. Americans love prolonged eye contact. It shows that you're confident. It shows that you are serious. It shows that you're sincere. And in Native American, that's true in averting the eyes. And so many Native Americans, especially while listening, won't maintain eye contact. It's not that they're not listening, or it's not like they're distracted. It's just how it is. And in American culture, that's viewed as bad to not maintain eye contact. It shows that maybe you're lying or hiding something, or are kind of shady or ashamed or something like that. But that's not how it is in Native American culture. If you hold prolonged eye contact in Native American context, it's kind of viewed as it's viewed as overexerting dominance or authority. And so that's why it's the eyes are averted, usually down to the right or to the left, to show respect and honor. So just to be aware of that and understand that difference when it comes to eye contact. Next is pointing. Americans typically point with one finger, and to show preciseness of what exactly you're drawing attention to. In Native American culture, um, it's it's we have unique ways of pointing. My tribe points with their lips. Sub-tribes point in creative ways. I know of one tribe that points with their tongue. It gets pretty creative, but never with one finger. In American culture, it's bad to be too vague. It's good to be precise. And that's why most Americans use one finger. But in Native American culture, it's taboo to point one finger. It's often affiliated with placing a curse or something similar to that effect. And so if you have to point, I would recommend to point with maybe all your fingers with an open hand to wherever you're pointing. So keep that in mind as well. Next, another thing to keep in mind and understand is the respect and trust component. In American culture, it's very individually based. And so everyone is seen as an individual and is treated as an individual, versus Native American culture, it's very collective based. Everyone is viewed as collective. In other words, as a tribe, or as a family, or as a village. So there is that difference in perception of respect and trust. And that's why we introduce ourselves according to tribes and clans and village, is because then we are affiliated with all of that respect and trust and honor from that tribe, that clan, and that village, and that family name. And in American culture, it's bad to have preconceived notions. And in other words, when you meet people, you typically have a blank slate. And then you can either progress or degress according to the interactions with that individual. However, there are stereotypes, and American culture has continually gone to and away from and gone to and away from stereotypes. And so stereotypes come and go. But in the Native American culture, it's not good to treat people as a single individual. It takes community is a family, community is a village, community is a tribe, and that's why it's viewed together. And one thing I bring up with this every time is because there's that collective mindset, there might be some disrespect or distrust or dishonor with maybe the agency or group that you are representing or government that you're representing, or maybe what we would even call the white man tribe. So I ask you, please, if you're treated with disrespect or trust or uncertainty, please don't take it personally. It's just part of that collective mindset. And the best way that I can explain this is using in a sports analogy. Some people have favorite sports teams. And if you meet a stranger who has that same favorite sports team as you don't know them, but right off the bat, you're kind of like long lost buddies because you connect on that same quote unquote tribe. And equally, if you meet a stranger who is a huge fan of your rival team, you don't know anything about them other than that, and already you're kind of at odds with them, even though you don't know anything apart from that they support your rival team. And so this is kind of that collective tribal mentality of, oh, you're with them, or at minimum, you're not with us. And so if you are treated with some disrespect or distrust, again, I ask you, please don't take that personally. What I do ask you is to show this is an opportunity to add credit to whatever you're representing and to revive or redeem that relationship and that bond. And that takes time and that takes effort on both sides. And these are just some tools to help improve that. So that is respect and trust. Because of time, I kind of group some of these together to allow for some questions and answers at the end. But some other before meeting pointers is to research terminology, just like we talked about before. Some tribes, the land and the tribe's name are the same. Sometimes they're different. So it's good to research the different terminology. Also to keep in mind with terminology is tribal names change or they have their own given names. For an example, Thona Atam used to be formerly Papago, and we renamed ourselves according to our own language. Navajo is also a given name from a different tribe, and we often call ourselves Dene. And so these are just some things to keep in mind as well. It's also good not to touch things. Some things are really sacred and can only be touched by certain people at certain times during certain events. And they could be little things that you didn't think were important. So if you do have to touch something, it's good to ask the tribal people you are with permission, or at least state that you are going to touch them, touch the thing, and they can giving them an opportunity to say no or let you go on about your business. It's good to eat food if it's offered. If you reject food, it shows that you're kind of rejecting that exchange of giving and receiving and having community with. Typically, food is offered at meetings, at gatherings, at events. Food is kind of a big deal that we eat we share with each other. And so participating in that sharing goes a long way, as well as not sharing in that can also go a long way, but in the other direction. Also, it's important to keep in mind that you are a guest. Those who watched my tribal sovereignty webinar understand that it's really a different country. It's a different land with a different government, different laws, different customs, regulations. When I travel to different countries throughout the world, I have to keep in mind that it's not the US, that it's a different land, it's different laws, different languages. So understand that as well if you are on a reservation or rancheria. Next, to see if there's a consultation protocol, either with whatever entity you are with, or the tribe also usually has a consultation protocol. These are things to keep in mind before the meeting. Next, I'll cover in during the meeting. Handshakes. This isn't so much a big deal now because of COVID, but I kept this because it's important to understand. One is Americans love strong handshakes. It shows that you are dedicated, that you have a strong work ethic, that you put a lot of yourself into what you do. In Native American culture, it shows that you're relaxed with a relaxed handshake. It's not a dead fish handshake. American cultures don't like the dead fish handshake. It shows the opposite of what Americans like to show. It shows it can portray a poor work ethic, that you don't put much into what you do. And in American culture, Native American culture, a firm handshake can be seen as a display of dominance, as showing anger or aggression or harboring hatred towards that person. So this is something to keep in mind when handshakes come back into society again, and to keep that in mind with Native American culture, that it's not a dead fish handshake, but it's not a strong grip handshake either. It's a light firm, that's what I would call it. And so understanding that difference. And then decision making, Americans like to be what I would call factual base. They can make, in other words, this is the only way a decision can be made. So that's the only conclusion this decision can come up to. So I've already worked through that process. And so here's a shortcut to that decision making. Here's the answer. Native Americans typically have a collective basis for decision making, and they have to work through that process, even if there's already a predetermined outcome. Americans don't like risk-driven decisions. Everything's calculated and has a reason, and there's almost like a formula in decision making. And each of those formulas are different for different people. But Native Americans don't like a predetermined decision. It's taboo to tell another person what to do. In other words, you allow everyone to go through that journey, and you can give people the information to make along that journey, but the conclusion that they need to come up with is a process they need to do on their own. So that's to understand that kind of difference as well. Talking and answering. Americans have this unique process where they listen with a third of their mind, they're processing with the other third of their mind, and they're already regurgitating a response with the other third of their mind. And Native Americans, when they talk and they answer, they have this long response. And it's because we come from storytelling, an oral tradition, and some of it may seem like it's far out there, but eventually it ties back in. And so if you're in a meeting and a Native American has this long response, it just understand that it's part of that storytelling. I know Americans don't like rambling. Sometimes it's, straight to the point. But in Native American culture, it's taboo to interrupt when someone is speaking, especially someone who is in a position of authority, and especially someone who is an elder or has an expertise within their realm. So it'd be good to understand that some of the responses may be long and it may go out there, but it ties back in. And part of this is there's a silence that also happens because Native Americans typically don't do that third increments like Native Americans or regular Americans do. But Native Americans typically listen 100%. And so then when you're done talking, then they'll process. So there's this kind of moment of silence and reflection. And then there's the 100% of response. And so if there is some pause time in between your question and their answer, it's okay, it's normal. And it's part of that process that is included in the talking and answering and responding. So understand that difference as well. Time. I need to look at the time while I'm on this slide. Americans are pretty precise. They have alarms, schedules, and everything is time oriented. There's that, famous saying, if you're not to be early is to be on time, and to be on time is to be late. In American culture, it's not the same. It's not the same ideology around time. Time is not incremental in minutes or seconds. It's based around honor. In other words, when the right time is the time that it is right. And so that's kind of the ideology around time is it's really honor based in the sense of if I'm helping my grandma move groceries into the house, that is more honorable than letting her do it on her own and showing up early to a meeting. I'd rather help my grandma and then show up late to the meeting. And that's what I mean around time. But some people will say, sorry, grandma, I'm going to be late to a meeting. And so that's kind of the concepts of time. And Americans don't like lateness. It's kind of viewed as a poor reflection on them or even the person hosting the meeting. And Native Americans don't like to be rushed through time. Most Native Americans don't have watches because this little thing doesn't ruin or run or dictate our lives. We do that. And so it's kind of a difference in ideology around time. So that's something to understand. If they show up late to a meeting, don't take that personally or don't hold that personally against them. Because there's a lot of things that may happen in the background that we do not know of or don't consider. So this is something to keep in mind with time. Also, during meetings, they may start with prayer. Understand that just might be what happens. And state your role and responsibility, just so they know that what kind of decision making and authority and what capacity do you represent whoever you're representing. These are good things to keep in mind and to state clearly. When writing things down, it's good to state what you're writing down. For an example, I'm just taking notes on what I'm observing here. Because secrets and whispering is taboo in Native American culture. And writing things down without mentioning it is kind of on that same level. Tribes may never mention it, but they definitely suspect it. So put their mind at ease by stating what you're writing down. Also, permission for pictures. Most tribes, it's bad to just flat out take a picture. It's good to ask, may I take a picture of this project site or this location or this item? And then tribes will say yes, or be ready if they say no. So understand that that's still a thing with pictures. You don't just take an image, you don't just take their perception of what it is. And then avoid jargon, acronyms. We all been with certain entities for a long time and understand that Tribes may not be up to date on whatever your entity's jargon acronyms are, so feel free to keep that in mind as well, although I'm sure most of you do a good job at doing that anyways. As I transition into after the meeting, and I want to stress the partnership. Americans usually base interactions on need, in a sense of we are interacting only when I need something from you. And this is to be efficient and no, there's no time wasted. In other words, partnerships are typically project-based, but in Native American culture, it's very relationship-based. In other words, there is an interaction that happens even if you don't need or want something, typically in Native American culture. It's just part of that community and that relationship. In American culture, it's bad to have unbillable hours, unbillable work, and that contributes to maintaining and strengthening and building that relationship. But in Native American culture, it's bad to be exclusively business. Some tribes don't like to only interact when you need something. Sometimes they like a hello or happy holiday or different things like that, to help build and maintain that relationship. So that's something to keep in mind and to understand in a relationship, to maintain that relationship even if you don't need something. To wish them well-being, to check in on them, to give them a phone call, shoot them a quick email, stop by their office. These are all things that go a long way into building a relationship. And when choosing a project, sometimes tribes don't pick the lowest budget or the quickest timeline or the best delivery. Sometimes they pick the best relationship. And this because it's that important. They're willing to delay the timeline, pay the extra, or not have, they're willing to do all that for that relationship, sometimes. And so that's good to keep in mind. As I begin to wind this down, some things to understand after the meeting is humor is a good sign. If they're joking with you or joking with each other, it's shown as a rapport. And then be understanding of accommodating deadlines. Some decisions can be made by the department, some by the tribal council, which meets monthly typically, and then some by the general council, which meets annually. So understanding, that decision process on the tribe side and how that may impact whatever deadlines you may have. Understanding confidentiality is key. And then best form of contact, just like we all have best preferences, tribes have best preferences, and it may be different than yours. This is probably something you're already implementing, but it's good to keep in mind as well. And then if you could take away one thing from today, it's that it's different, but different is not wrong. Different is okay, when understanding culture. A quick survey of best practices, then I'll go to Q&A. This is just a summary of my previous presentation on tribal sovereignty to understand that they're pre-existing nations that predate the US, understand their history, their recognition status, their government structure and function, and understand that it's really a government-to-government relationship, whether you're an entity, an agency, a city, a county, or a state, or the federal government. It's a government-to-government relationship with a tribe. And understanding tribal consultation as it applies to formal or informal, and to understand the purpose and outcome of consultation, and to manage any kind of conflict that may come up. And tribal lands, understand the jurisdiction in regards to rancherias or reservations, understanding the difference between trusts and fee land. This ties in with my presentation on tribal lands. just like my previous presentation titled tied in with consultation and understanding those differences as well. What I'll be covering in the future presentations is tribal cultural resources, understanding when archaeological surveys increase from 1, 2, or 3, and the good mitigation measures, as well as interacting with each of the either TIPO or SHPO or cultural director or monitors, and how to progress past those roadblocks. And then also I'll be doing tribal confidentiality when it comes to sacred lands or sacred resources, and understand that there are different levels of legal, ethical, and moral. Legal is definitely the minimum, and understanding those differences when it comes to publishing or communications, and when does the Brown Act come into play as well. So be aware of those, and those are the best practices. And I believe I have 7 minutes left for questions and answers. So thank you for giving me your time, and I'll open it up to questions. And there's my contact information if you want to shoot me any kind of questions that we don't get time to. But I don't know if there are any questions that anyone has, and I'll hand it over to Bob to facilitate the questions.
Okay, Ethan, thank you. And I won't rush you. So if people need to sign off at 1 o'clock, feel free to do that, and we can continue with questions. So we do have 3 right now. Feel free to add some more. I did want to say I did put those links into that so some of the earlier tribal presentations that Ethan did are available on our YouTube channel, which I gave you the link for. So we have 2 questions about food. People must be hungry. But first one, I'll give you them both. So first is, would it be acceptable to bring food to a meeting to participate in the sharing? And how to react to the food offered if it hurts. So whether you got allergy or vegan or gluten-free, or, you know, what if it's the wrong kind of food for you?
Yes. In response to the first question, yes, you can bring your own food. It's good to state it and ask, is it good if I bring this or that? That's good, and it shows that you're sharing and contributing, and sometimes the meals are potluck if it's not catered, so that could fit in perfectly, but always check with the tribe. Regard to the food allergy or anything like that, I hope that there is a variety of food being offered, and so it'd be good to at least eat something in context of that. And so I would expect that there would be at least one thing there that could be eaten. And so, but if not, then in answer to the first question, how it ties in with the first question as well, maybe bring something you can eat, or maybe state before you show up that you have these certain restrictions, and want to make sure that there's something there that you can eat. That way it's not seen in the moment that you're rejecting something, that it's foresight.
Great. And then we have a cross-cultural question. So the question is, could my efforts in taking some of the advice be seen as rude? For example, if I avert eye contact because now I know it's too assertive, could a tribal member think that because I am American, I should be trying to make eye contact? How to be respectful without appropriating or being disingenuous?
This is a really good question. And that's why I added that it's an art and not just a science. In other words, it's not just a science that you can just plug and chug and get results. It's an art that it's an ever shifting target on both sides. And you have to, just like an artist, find that sweet spot in that zone, and that takes time and getting to know the people you're interacting with. And so it will be a little rough at first, but after a bit of time, then you'll find that sweet spot to interact with. And so that's good to keep in mind, and that's a great question. Um, and most tribes will see that effort and acknowledge that. And so I don't think it'd be just disingenuous. And so, but that's a good question, and I hope that answer is satisfactory. And I would say it depends on the tribe. And at first, it'll be a little rough, and as you ease into the relationship, it'll be easier and easier and easier as the the art component has a role.
I think one of the overall responses you've kind of given is it's okay to ask questions if something's okay or not. Sometimes we want to
Yes,
be right all the time, and sometimes we just don't know the answer.
yes, and that's the knowledge is what you have now, and then the awareness is understanding where they're at in the context that you're in, and then competency is when that is done well. So it goes back to that chart that I shared earlier. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Ethan. We have no other open questions. You have your contact information. You will get tomorrow, everyone who attended and didn't attend will get a link to the YouTube recording. And so you can watch this again if you have questions. So, all right, thanks again.